showing off. Don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight. Better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight. Won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me?
Okay. Good evening. Welcome. We all ready for another Star Wars reading? Another short story from Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina? I am. So, let's just jump straight on into it. No reason to wait. This story is 26 pages, so it shouldn't take too awfully long. So, all right. This one is Nightlily, The Lover's Tale by Barbara Hambly, in case you were wondering. She wrote several novels back in the day for Star Wars, full-length novels. All right. So, Madam, I am most sorry. Feltepern Trevag switched off the computer screen above his desk with the air of being anything but. If you don't pay your water impost, there isn't anything I can do about your water line being shut. I don't make the taxes. As it happened, he had made this one, or at least made the suggestion to the city prefect of the port of Mos Eisley that the water impost be raised 25%. But Trevag reasoned, rubbing his head cones as he listened once again to the Modbrek female's frantic plea for more time, she probably wouldn't have been able to come up with the original impost, so it didn't really matter. What mattered was that now, through proper go-betweens, of course, he'd be able to offer her a few thousand credits for her dwelling compound, which she'd be glad to accept after going without water or food for a couple of days, and rent it out by the room, provided, of course, he could arrange it with his go-betweens before the prefect heard about it and outbid him. The Modbrek female's distress irritated him. Coming from another of his own species, another Godel, it might have evoked pity, though Trevag had been less ready than many of his compatriots to yield to emanations of wretchedness and fear. But Modbreks were, in Trevag's opinion, only semi-sentient, wispy, ephemeral beings, hairless as slugs, save for the grotesque masses of blue mane that streamed from their undeveloped heads, with huge eyes and tiny noses and mouths in pointy, pale faces. This female and her daughters, sending forth waves of anxiety, reacted on him as a kind of screechy music. "Madam," he said at last, sighing, "I am not your father, and I am not a charity worker, and if you knew you couldn't pay your water imposts, which I assume you did know, since you've been in arrears for 2 months, and neither you nor your daughters have troubled to find decent paying work, you should have gone to your family or some charity organization before this." He nudged a toggle on the control board of his desk. A human deputy in a rumpled uniform came in and showed the 3 females out. Trevag could sense the man's pity for them, and also, much to Trevag's disgust, the fact that the human found the insubstantial creatures physically attractive, even sexually interesting. Of course, Trevag had always had difficulty understanding how humans found each other sexually interesting. Wan, flabby, squishy, they lacked both the Godel ability to transmit a range of emotional waves, and the contrast between strength and weakness, so necessary to pleasure. How could anyone? He shrugged and turned back to his desk to tap through a call. Behind him he heard a step on the threshold, felt the heat of a body, no closer than the threshold, and human range, and recognized the electromagnetic aura as that of Predna Baloo, assistant security officer of Mos Eisley. Felt too like a smoky darkness the man's weariness, the bitter tang of his disgust. You couldn't have let her have another month? Baloo's raspy voice sounded tired. The heat of the Tatooine sun seems to have long ago baked out of Baloo the savagery, the enthusiasm so necessary to a hunter. Travag despised him. She's had two. Water's expensive to import. A message flickered across the black screen of the receiver. Pilocam 1130. Travag moved a finger, and the pixels wiped themselves away as if they had never been. He turned in his chair to face Baloo, a heavy man, slope-shouldered, in his wrinkled, dark blue uniform, hair black, eyes black, but the pitiful stubble of what humans called beard was thickly shot with gray. A head like a melon. Travag never could look at humans without feeling contempt and a little amusement. He knew they had other types of sensory organs than head cones, but even after many years on the space lanes, as bounty hunter, imperial bodyguard, and officer of ship security, Travag had never gotten over how silly, how ineffectual beings looked who didn't have cones. On Antar 4, though everyone knew in their heart of hearts that the size of one's cones didn't affect their ability to pick up sensory vibration, Goddles whose cones were undeveloped frequently resorted to falsies. He simply instinctively had no respect for a being without them. Be ready with your deputy to close the water lines to her compound tomorrow. Baloo's mouth tightened under heavy cheeks, but he nodded. I'm going out. I should be back within the hour. Walking through the marketplace of Mos Eisley always filled Travag with a sense close to intoxication. A hunter by upbringing as well as by blood, he had quickly found his current position as a tax official a disappointment. What had been represented to him as an opportunity for acquiring vast quantities of credits had turned out to be little more than a clerical stint. Yet he knew that there were credits there to be made. In the marketplace of Mos Eisley, the hunter stirred again in his blood. Awnings flapped overhead in the baked breeze, the solar coats casting black rectangles of hard shadow, the cheaper cotton and rags staining the faces of those beneath them with red and blue light. The harsh sizzle of bantha burgers and much-used fritter grease swirled from 100 little stands, wherever some enterprising Jawa or Whiffid could find room to set up a solar power stove. Races from every corner of the galaxy wandered the banded shadows of this makeshift labyrinth. Oh, I just barely noticed you said there was an advert. Sorry. Races from every corner of the galaxy wandered the banded shadows of this makeshift labyrinth. In one place, a corpse-faced Durosian was holding up strings of opaline sand pearls and sun-stained blue glass for a couple of inquisitive human tourists. In another, a nearly nude Gamorrean belly dancer was performing on a yellow-striped blanket to the appreciative whistles of a couple of Celestans, who were among the many races to find Gamorreans attractive. But more than anything else, it was the air of danger that filled the place. The edginess, the watchfulness, that soaked Travag's cones like drugged wine. After a week in the marketplace, he always came away... after a walk in the marketplace, he always came away wondering if he shouldn't pack in the Imperial service and go back to the hunt. But as always, he looked around him a second time, and saw how many of these people were dressed in cast-offs or shabby desert gear. He stroked his new jacket of deep green Yulra suede, his close-fitting trousers tailored for his form and no other, and thought again. He might not have made his fortune on this blasted piece of rock, but at least he could make a little, and the opportunity would come. Had come. His pulses quickened at the implications of the vibration he'd sensed 2 weeks ago, walking through this very market. All he needed to do, he told himself, was be a hunter and wait. The chance of his lifetime had come, and if he waited, it would come again, if things went right. Jabba the Hutt's go-between, an enormously obese Celestin named Jub Vegnu, was waiting for him by Pilocam's health food booth. Pilocam, an aged and fragile human in trailing, dirt-colored rags and a garish orange scarf, had been optimistically peddling fruit juices and steamed balls of vegetable gratings for years now, surrounded on all sides by a dripping banquet of dewback ribs and mega-sweet fritters. No sugars, no salts, no artificial additives, and no customers. Even Jabba had given up trying to get a percentage of his non-existent takings. Vegnu was leaning on the counter, eating a caramelized pkneb, something Pilocam would never have stocked, the juice of it running down what chin he possessed. Trevog bought a sugar fritter Trevog bought a sugar fritter from a nearby stand and joined him. At Pilocam's, they could be assured of being completely uninterrupted. I need to set up a go-between and a loan deal, grated Trevog in his harsh, rather monotonous voice. Immediate takeover in 3 days, complete secrecy from everyone. 10% to Jabba of all subsequent take. They haggled a little bit about the percentage and about what the deal was. Trevog knowing full well that if word got to the prefect, or indeed to several other members of the Imperial service that he knew about, he'd be very likely outbid before the widowed Modbrek even decided she had to sell. In time, Trevog got guarantees of secrecy for what they were worth, but at the cost of another 4 percentage points. At that rate, he thought bitterly, it would take him a year to make back his investment. Is that it, then? The Celestin inquired, licking his stubby fingers of the last traces of caramel and grease. Trevog hesitated, and the go-between, with almost Godel sensitivity, tilted his head, waiting for what would come next, seeming to feel, Trevog thought, how big the coming deal was. Not quite. There was no need to scan the marketplace visually. Trevog knew the hint he'd gotten, the buzzing, shivering sense he'd picked up in passing through 2 weeks ago, was nowhere around, and he didn't know when it would return, when the person, the creature that had caused it, would next pass through Mos Eisley. But it was as well to be ready. I will need a go-between in another deal, he said slowly. For what? I can't say. He held up his hand against Vegnu's impatient protest. Not yet, but I need someone to act for me in a situation where, as an employee of the Imperial government, I would be expected to perform as a part of my duties. Ah, Vegnu leaned back against the counter, but a civilian performing the same task would be rewarded? Well rewarded, said Trevog, his pulses stirring again at the thought of just how well rewarded. And it's a task well within, say, your capabilities. How much? 20%. Gah! 25, said Trevog, and that 5 is for secrecy, for absolute secrecy at the time. About you, and about the nature of the task. The nature of the task, thought Trevog, threading his way swiftly through the blazing slats of dust and shadow, heading back toward the government offices. A few minutes later, that is, after all, the delicate thing about this deal, a simple task informing the Imperial Moff of the sector about someone for whom they had been looking for a long time. The sense that had come to him in the market 2 weeks ago had been like finding a jewel in the dirt. the vibration itself like a sniff of perfume, scented once in other circumstances but never forgotten. The trick would be, of course, to keep his go-between from taking that jewel, that one piece of information, that name, and turning it in himself. Trevag the Godel knew he would have to be very careful with this one, whose reward could get him the foundations of real wealth. Passing through the market 2 weeks ago, he had picked up the unmistakable vibrations of a Jedi Master. Later to see you, reported the operations clerk in the next cubicle as Trevag re-entered the office. After the blast furnace of the noon street, the prefecture seemed shadowy and cool as a cave. The solar deflectors on the roof didn't really start having trouble until 2 or 3 hours past noon. Were it not for the shelves jammed with boxes of data disks and dust-yellowed hard copies drooping from overstuffed storage boxes stacked along one wall, were it not for the almost palpable atmosphere of defeat, of grimy hopes and petty spites, the offices themselves would be pleasant to enter after a time outside. Only so long, thought Trevag as he strode toward his office, only so long will I have to put up with this place. It was no place for a hunter to be, no place for a true Godel. Just until he could accomplish his final hunt, trap his final quarry, until he could return over to the Empire information about this Jedi, whoever he was. He hadn't been a passer through, that much Trevag knew. After losing the sense of the Jedi's vibrations in the marketplace, the thick, strange buzzing in his cones that he had been told long ago was the concentration of the unknown force, the magic of the Jedi, he had gone at once to the docking bays, ascertained that no vessel had taken off for the past several hours. As collector of imposts, he had access to passenger lists, and had made it his business to personally check each traveler. And in 2 weeks of roving every corner of Mos Eisley, he had never sensed that particular reaction again. So it must be someone on the planet, but not in the town. Someone who had come to do marketing, for instance. Trevag was a hunter. He would wait. His mind was full of this rather than whoever this tedious female was that she wanted and what she wanted of him, when he stepped through the office doorway and fell in love. The vibration of her filled the room. Before she even turned at his entrance, it was an intoxicant, a heady compound of milky warmth that he could feel almost through his skin, of trembling vulnerability, of an electrospectrum aura like a new-blown pink tila blossom, and of an innocent and unself-conscious sexuality that almost lifted Trevag off his feet. She turned, putting back the white gauze of her veil, to reveal an alien loveliness that stopped his breath. What race, what species she was, he didn't know. It didn't matter. Skin blue-gray as desert's final twilight, molded over the proud jut of cheekbones any woman on his home planet of Antar would kill to possess. Double, treble rows of them, blending softly into the fragile ridges of the chin. More ridges led the eye into the graceful curve of proboscis, a feature Trevag had always considered striking in such races, like the Kubas or the Rhodians who possessed them. Eyes wide, green as grass, and fringed with ferny lashes, peered timidly from beneath a deep splendor of brow ridge, like the eyes of a rock tablet too frightened to flee a hunter's step. But above the brow was what drew Trevag's eyes. Half hidden by the cloaking gauze of the veil, the skull rose into 4 perfectly shaped, exquisite conelets. Their smallness, their smoothness seemed to invite the touch of a male hand, the breath of male lips. Of course, they couldn't really be cones, thought Trevag the next moment. She was not Godel, but someone of the dull-minded and insentient lesser races. But the imitation was perfect, and it was enough. He wanted her. He wanted her badly. Sir, her voice was halting, but of a beautiful, even key, modulated like a deep-toned flute through the proboscis. Her three-fingered hands, skin-tailored over jewel-like knobs, seemed to cling to the edges of the veil, and she had just laid aside, as if for protection. Sir, you must help me. They said I should come to you. Travag found himself saying anything, then quickly correcting himself, for he was, after all, an official of the Empire. He added, anything in my power to assist you, miss. What seems to be the trouble? I have been put ashore. Distress and fear blossomed from her in trembling waves. They said there was something wrong with my papers. There was a passage tax. Travag knew all about the passage tax. That was something else he'd come up with. I had to budget very closely in order to visit my sister on Kona. My family is not wealthy. Now I've lost my seat on the Tell of Our Lady, but if I pay the passage tax, I won't have enough to return to my mother on Hnemthi. The name of her home world came out like a dainty sneeze, unbelievably entrancing. The vibration of her sorrow was like the taste of blood honey. My dear, he hesitated, Miyum Onith, she supplied. The Miyum is the white flower that blossoms in the season of trine, the season when all three moons give their light, the Nightlily. And I am Feltepern Travag, officer of the Empire. My dear Nightlily, I shall go investigate this matter at once. It grieves me to be unable to offer you better quarters to wait in, but this city is not a savory one. I shall return within moments. Baloo was in the outer office, boots on desk, drinking a fizzy whose bulb sweated in the stuffy heat. He cocked a dark eye at the Godel as Travag closed his office door. Give the child back her seat, Travag, he grunted. You don't need the 75 credits. You run, you can catch the telly before she lifts. Travag leaned across the officer and tapped a key on the board. The screen manifested the schedule. Unlike many Godel, Travag had mastered computers quickly, once those in the prefecture had been properly shielded. The Tell of Our Lady lifted at 1400, and he knew Captain Fane was punctual. But an hour wouldn't be enough. Travag, the officer's voice halted him as he reached for the door. Travag turned, mostly from a desire to legitimately waste time. He'd have to walk very slowly indeed to actually miss the Tell of Our Lady's lift. You're a hunter. You ever hear of the Force? Travag went absolutely cold inside. He only said, no. It's supposed to be some kind of magic field. Baloo shook his head. The old Jedi were supposed to have it. He lifted a hand to indicate the Imperial communique tacked to the discolored plaster of the wall behind him, offering 50,000 credits for any members of the so-called Jedi Knights. 10,000 for information leading to the capture of. Unless, of course, it was the captor's or informant's job to capture or inform. Then they just got their salaries and a nice letter of commendation from the local Moff. I heard rumors the Jedi have been seen on Tatooine, said Baloo. I've had a watch on Pilocum's stand, figuring the one place a Jedi might show up. Someone's got to drink that herb tea, but I wonder if you'd run across anything strange. Only what Pilocam serves at that stand of his, grumbled Travag, and made a far more precipitate exit than he'd planned. It still took him a great deal of dawdling on the way to reach Docking Bay 9 too late to drop the to stop the liftoff of the lady. Nightlily was dazzled to be taken to luncheon at the Court of the Fountain, the closest thing to a high-class restaurant Mos Eisley boasted. It occupied one of the sprawling stone and stucco palaces that dated from Mos Eisley's long-ago boom days. Reflective solar screens had been stretched over the many courtyards where fountains trickled and gurgled among exotic plants and gem-like tiling. It was small, of course, and catered mostly to the tourist trade, but Nightlily was a tourist, and she was enchanted. Jabba the Hutt, because, of course, Jabba owned the palace, boasted that there wasn't an appetite in the galaxy that couldn't be catered to by his personal chef, Porcellus. Porcellus, who only operated the Court of the Fountain during those hours not spent in preparing the bloated one's gargantuan repasts, knew perfectly well that he'd be fed to Jabba's pet rancor if the Hutt ever grew bored with his menus. So he was an enthusiastic chef indeed, and in a way he took great pride in his work. The fillet of baby dewback with caper sauce and fleek liver pâté was the best Travag had ever eaten, and when Nightlily hooned with modestly downcast eyes that virgins of her people were only permitted fruits and vegetables, Porcellus outdid himself in the production of 4 courses of lipana berries and honey, puptons of dried magicots, and psibara, a baked fell bar with savory cream, and staggeringly good bread pudding for dessert. And a great deal of wine, of course. "Nothing is too expensive for you, beautiful one," responded Travag to her hummed protest about the expense, "or too good. Have another glass, my darling." He would definitely, he thought, have to have a chef who could cook dewback like this when he collected his reward. Don't you understand that fate has brought us together? Fate in the form of a stupid ruling by a venal official. He took her hand in his, loving the satin texture, the smooth eroticism of the way the knots on its back tightened and swelled at his touch. "Don't you understand what I feel for you, what I felt for you the moment I entered the office, the moment I heard your voice, the moment I sensed in you the ultimate prey, the most beautiful of conquests to be vanquished?" She turned her face aside, confused. Excuse me. She turned her face aside, confused. The long silver serpent of her knife-point tongue ran nervously out to pick at the remains of the bread pudding in a gesture he found almost unbearably sexual. It had to be muscled to those three sets of cheekbones on the inside. What could he not persuade her to do with that tongue? He wasn't sure exactly what inner vibrations he should transmit to convince her of his overwhelming desire for her. She obviously didn't have the civilized sensitivity of a Gödel, maybe couldn't pick up anything at all, and was operating entirely at the face value of his words. Judging by her conversation, she was either barely sentient or truly stupid, and in any case, Travag had very little interest in females' thoughts or desires. He cradled the side of her face with his hand, reveling in the daintiness of the cheekbones under his clawed strength. He felt her timidity, and with it a dawning wonderment, a surge of glowing excitement in her heart. "Don't you understand that I need you? Are you proposing marriage?" She stared up at him, awed, dazzled, halfway to surrender. Softly he nuzzled the side of her face. Stupid as a brick, he thought, but he'd get this one into his bed before the day was through. "Travag, leave the girl alone," Baloo spoke in a low voice so that Nightlily in the outer office would not hear. The security officer slouched in the doorway of Travag's cubicle while the Gödel keyed through a credit transfer and ticketing information on the Star Swan. leaving early tomorrow morning. The least he could do, he reflected, was give the girl passage out of here, third class, naturally, to wherever the hell she was going. Besides, once he'd had her, he certainly didn't want her hanging around under the impression that he was actually going to go through with marrying a semi-sentient alien bimbo, wondrous though she might be between the sheets. Leave her alone? Travag turned around disbelievingly, staring at the human. He kept his voice quiet, still excluding Nightlily, who was just visible through the doorway past Baloo's shoulder, sitting at an empty desk with her head bowed in shy ecstasy and her veils half drawn about her face. You can be anywhere within 4 meters of that love morsel, and you say leave her alone? Baloo turned his head to consider her. Travag could tell from the man's temperature and the vibration of his pulses, even at this distance, that he found her no more sexually stimulating than he'd have found a Jawa. Disgust flooded him at the sheer galling insensitivity of humans. Travag, said the officer, most species, most civilizations ostracize members who bear hybrid children. If you find her attractive, there's probably enough enzyme compatibility for you to get her with child. You'd be ruining her for life. Travag emitted a sharp barking laugh. I can't believe you. You're within 2 meters of that, and you're talking to me about enzyme compatibility? Man, grow some gonads. If she was worried about that, she shouldn't be traipsing around the galaxy in that flimsy little head veil in the first place. Baloo put his hand on Travag's arm warningly, and the Godel halted in surprise. Baloo seldom showed any disposition to care about anything, but there was a definite threat in his dark eyes. Patiently, Travag promised, All right, I'm only taking her out for a walk. She can always say no. But after 3 drinks at the Mos Eisley Cantina, he reflected, as he entered the outer office again and took Nightlily's arm, not to mention the prospect of marriage that seemed to push every switch on her board, it wasn't at all likely that she would. I can't believe that you would truly love me enough to wed, crooned the girl, as they crossed the brazen burnish of dust and sunlight in the street. The males of my species fear that commitment, that giving of all for love. The males of your species are fools, growled Travag, gazing deep into her eyes and drinking in the heady perfume of her sexuality. As far as he was concerned, that went for the females too, but he didn't say so. He glanced back from the shadows of the buildings opposite, just in time to see a flicker of dusty robes, the trailing brightness of an orange scarf. Pylocam, the health food seller, crossing the street to the government offices. The Godel's mind seemed to click, all things falling into place with a hunter's cutting instinct. Baloo Pylocam had seen the Jedi. His first reaction was sheer annoyance. He'd already told Nightlily he'd booked passage for her on the Star Swan, and she'd flung her arms around him, asked if he had booked his own passage to come to Hinnenemph to marry her with due ceremony before her mother and sisters. He'd gotten out of that one by promising to embark within a few days. I'm an official of the Empire, you know. I can't just leave everything all in a moment, though, believe me, I will be counting the days. But it meant that there was no putting her off. There was no reason for Pylocam to come to the impost offices other than to report to Baloo, and he knew Baloo, for all his world-weary slovenliness, was not one to waste time. He'd investigate, and he'd report. And that meant Travag would have to find someone to assassinate Baloo this afternoon. Ordinarily, of course, he'd have gotten in touch with Jub Vegnu, set up a meeting, made an appointment with Jabba the Hutt, and arranged for payment. But of course he knew, everybody knew, that freelance assassins were 10 for a half credit in Mos Eisley, and most of them were supposed to hang out in the Mos Eisley Cantina. It couldn't be that difficult to meet one. The encounter would presumably be short and sweet. That's what assassins were for. to make life easy for those who had other things to do, leaving him plenty of the afternoon and all of the evening to conclude an encounter of another kind with Nightlily in the Mos Eisley Inn. If entering the government offices from the noon street was like passing into a more or less cool grotto, transition from the late afternoon dust and glare into the near darkness of the cantina was comparable to being swallowed by a bantha with indigestion. Trevog's hunter eyes switched almost instantaneously from day vision to night as a great drench of vibration hit him. Overlapping electrospectrum fields, personal magnetic auras buzzing like a hive of bees, halos of halos of irritation and annoyance, swollen by the proximity of strangers and exacerbated by every sort of psycho and neural relevant relaxant. Wow, I'm falling apart here. Relaxant known in the galaxy. It was like the marketplace, only more sinister, without the bright spiciness of making a living. The thoughts of and emotions swirled through the gloom were darker, more dangerous. Against the brassy twirling of the little dark cloth insectoid band. Are you sure it's safe? Hummed Nightlily, clinging once more to his arm, and Trevog patted her hand. Her fear reacted on his hunter's instinct as her anxiety and distress had earlier. Prey signals that read as an invitation to conquest. He felt an almost overwhelming desire to crush her in his arms. Instead, he cradled the back of her exquisite coned head in one hand, said, "With me you're safe, my blossom. With me you'll always be safe." Okay. They took one of the small booths to the left of the raised entry vestibule. Nightlily gazed around her fearfully, marveling. In addition to being a virgin, she had confessed to Trevog over lunch she had never been away from her home planet before, had never seen anything like this. As well, she hadn't, thought the Godel, amused at the way she relaxed under the influence of Wooher, the barkeep's drinks computer. In another booth, a completely illegal card game was in progress between a ghoulish given, a giant one-eyed abyssin, and a big fluffy white thing of a species even Trevog had never seen. In another, a shaggy, ferocious-looking wolf man sipped his drink alone, while Nightlily sighed and giggled over her second drink and asked him, "Are you truly sure, beloved? Mating is such a solemn thing, such an awe-inspiring thing." Trevog was searching the crowd with his eyes, and, more importantly, with his cones, seeking out the vibrations of danger and blood, the vibrations of another hunter, as he had once been. "It is as nothing," Trevog said. "No sacrifice is too great for what I feel for you." The fact that she couldn't even detect him in a lie, that she didn't have that much sensitivity to the vibrations of his mind, only redoubled his contempt for her. So desirable, so innocent, so stupid. No wonder they don't let virgins travel off her planet. She'd told him that, too. They'd never make it home. Not as virgins, anyway. Meantime, his hunter senses roved the dark forms, seeking another hunter. The two tall human females drinking by the bar were a maybe. They sparkled with danger, a flame-like brightness that some assassins had, but the color of their aura wasn't quite right. The Rhodian at another card table with his small ear-like antenna, swiveling nervously in the noise of the room, yes, definitely a killer, though Trevog wasn't certain he could take on Predna Balu. The Wolfman, yes, he looked big enough, tough enough, to take on the human and win. The brown-haired human talking quietly with an enormous Wookiee at another booth? Maybe. The edge was there, but not the darkness. The thin man smoking a hookah at the bar? Absolutely. His aura was dark, terrible, but there was a coldness about him that made Trevog wonder if he could be approached at all. That was one, he thought, who killed for a huge sum, or for his own pleasure, nothing between. For the rest, they were locals. The foul Dr. Evazan and his disgusting Aquilish friend were well known to Tervag, dangerous but not for hire. The horned and sinister-looking Deveronian, swaying his fingers dreamily to the music of the band, was much less dangerous than he appeared. The old spacer in most of a flight suit Tervag recognized as a smuggler who worked for the monastery, probably involved in something illegal, like most of the religious brothers of that organization, but he would stop far short of murder. And then he felt it. The rushing, buzzing sensation in his cones, the strange humming confusion, almost like the presence of a high-energy machine. And the Jedi came into the Cantina. He was a nondescript old human, his beard gone white as the hair of humans did with age, his robes shabby with wear and desert dust. He was trailed by a human youth, a back desert moisture farmer, by the look of his clothes and the way he stared around him, as Nightlily did, awed by what he thought was the big city, and by a couple of much battered droids whose power cells made Tervag's cones prickle. Wooher, the barkeep, swung immediately around. "Hey, we don't serve their kind here." "What?" said the boy, and the taller of the droids, a dented C-3PO, looked as disconcerted as it was possible for a droid to look. "You're droids. They'll have to wait outside. We don't want them here." Tervag, sitting only a few feet away, heartily concurred. It was difficult enough to think in here, to determine what he should do, with Nightlily so soft and vulnerable and giggly on one side, and the dark vibrations of the assassins on the other. "Listen, why don't you wait out by the speeder?" the boy said quietly, an unnecessary courtesy in Tervag's opinion. A C-3PO only looked human, and an R2-D2 didn't even do that. "We don't want any trouble." The old man, meanwhile, had gone to the bar and was deep in murmured conversation with the elderly monastic spacer in the flight suit. Tervag stretched his hearing to pick up their words, but over the music of the band it was not easy. Even less easy was it to hear something besides Nightlily's soft voice, slightly flown with unaccustomed substances, asking yet again humbly how he could truly love her so much. "Of course I do, of course," said Tervag, watching the old Jedi move into conversation with the towering Wookiee. He looked safe for a moment, and Tervag turned back to Nightlily, grasping the smooth, dark ivory of her hands. "Nightlily, you mean everything, everything to me." She said, "Oh," while staring up into his eyes. "Oh, Tervag, that we should have met like this, that you should have come into my life like this." He wondered if he could slip away for a moment, summon the city police, but he needed a go-between if he were to get the money. Slip away and contact Jub Vegnu. First speak to one of the assassins, in case Baloo had tracked the old man here himself. He felt the flare of emotions, of irrational rage and drunken aggression, before the yelling started. Swinging around in his chair, Tervag saw, to his horror, that the sinister Dr. Evazan had decided to pick a fight with the farm boy, throwing him sprawling into a table, while Wooher ducked under the bar, yelling desperately, "No blasters! No blasters!" and someone else grabbed for a sidearm. The roar of the force in Tervag's cone peaked like the drumming of a high desert gravel storm. The old man, in what seemed like a single smooth gesture, somehow had a glowing stalk of light in his hand, a lethal slash, a severed limb leaking blood on the floor, Nightlily's terrified hoot, and silence. A silence less shocked than cautious as everyone reevaluated the situation. Then the band started up again. So did the conversations. The wounded would-be combatant was taken away. So was the arm. By Wooher's small helper, Nakan, recognized as operating a fast food stand in the marketplace. The old Jedi picked up his young companion, moved off with the Wookiee to the booth where the brown-haired smuggler with the scar on his chin waited. Tervag became aware that Nightlily was clinging to his arm, and his every instinct told him now was the time to move in on her. Unfortunately, now was also the time to listen, to stretch out his hearing, to key and sharpen his hunter's awareness of every word they said. Trevog disengaged his arm from the trembling girl, stated, "You need something to calm you down, my blossom," and moved over to the bar, listening over the jumble of the music, the murmur of the crowd. Lingering by the bar, he heard the words to the Alderon system, and felt the swift rush of hunter's adrenaline in his veins. It was indeed now or never. Then a moment later he heard the old man say, 2,000 now, plus 15 when we reach Alderon. Trevog breathed a sigh of relief. That meant a delay here while they raised the cash. Probably they'd sell the speeder the boy had mentioned, or the droids, or all three. That only left the question of Baloo. The brown-haired human and the Wookiee were obviously not for hire as assassins. Judging by much of the conversation as he could hear, Trevog guessed they were only smugglers anyway. The Wolfman was engaged in a sharp altercation with a lamprey-like thing beside him, whose vibration caused Trevog to back quickly away, and nearby the hookah smoker felt too eerily dangerous, too deadly. That left the Rhodian. "Docking Bay 94, he heard the smuggler say, and the old man repeated it, 94. As Trevog returned to his booth with his own drink and Nightlily's double strength, and dosed with a love wallop pill Trevog had the foresight to slip into his pocket before leaving the office. He knew how much Wooher charged for them. There would now, he knew, be plenty of time. Riches, he thought, and the beautiful creature leaning on his arm, crooning softly, "Oh, my love, my love." Maybe he'd even spring for a first-class ticket for her. It was, after all, the least he could do. He wasn't surprised or particularly upset when the stormtroopers showed up. He even felt a kind of scorn for them as they looked around, for of course the old man and the boy had vanished. So incidentally did several other patrons, including the hookah smoker. The Rhodian didn't. Trevog observed this and slipped one hand from Nightlily's soft waist to feel in his belt pouch for the money he'd brought. 100 credits, he had been told, was the current going rate for the down payment on a man's life. He would be glad, he thought, to get this annoyance out of the way, to make sure Baloo was not going to cheat him out of the reward that was rightfully his. Unfortunately, just as Trevog was rising to go to the Rhodian's table, the Rhodian himself got up, with a shift in aura that told Trevog that this was indeed a hunter, closing in on his own prey. That prey, it turned out, was the brown-haired smuggler, who, after a prolonged altercation, shot the Rhodian neatly with a blaster drawn under the table. Nightlily shrieked again and clung to Trevog's arm. Wooher's helper ran to guard the remains, even as the smuggler and his Wookiee companion tossed the barkeep a couple of credits and took their leave. "Sorry about the mess." After a momentary pause, the band took up its tune without missing a bar. Disgusted and annoyed, because the Wolfman had also left by this time, Trevog gathered the flustered and languishing Nightlily on his arm. So much, he thought, for trying to shortcut middlemen. When he contacted Jubvegna to arrange information to the city prefect about intercepting the old man and the boy at spaceport speeders, he'd mentioned the need to dispose of Baloo for an extra 100 creds. That should take care of any competition for the reward for the old man's hide. And in the meantime, thought Trevog, slipping his arm around the trembling bundle of aromatic sensuality that fate had dropped into his lap, there was the matter of this girl and getting a room at the Mos Eisley Inn to consummate what she thought would be the start of a wonderful marriage. The more fool she. And what was in actuality merely the more delectable of the two hunts upon which he had engaged today. Really, Trevog thought, as he guided Nightlily's tipsy steps along the gold and shadow of the street outside, he might have retired from the trade, but he was still quite a passable hunter after all. What with the commotion of Imperial troopers coming into Mos Eisley to search for a pair of droids, the sudden rumors of a Sand People massacre on an outlying farm, and the firefight at Docking Bay 94 ending with a smuggling craft's illegal liftoff, nobody found Feltepern Travag's body until the following afternoon. "Didn't anybody tell him?" demanded Wooher, the bartender brought over to the Mos Eisley Inn by Baloo's deputy to view the body and give the security officer his deposition. "Tell him what?" Baloo looked up from jotting on his log pad. He'd never much liked the Godel, but that kind of death, evisceration with what looked to have been a long, thin knife, skillfully wielded, was something he wouldn't have wished on anyone. About Hnemth. When Baloo continued to look blank, the bartender added, "The girl he was with, the Hnemth female." "Nightlily?" Baloo was startled. The girl had looked too frightened by her surroundings and too dazzled by Travag's charms to have harmed a hair of the Godel's head. "Was that her name?" Wooher rolled his eyes. "It figures." A small crowd had gathered. Of course, none of the Imperial stormtroopers and none of the Prefect's guard either. A murder this small wasn't worth their time. Baloo couldn't help observing Nakar in the background slipping the coroner's deputy a few credits for what he decided not to ask. The Miyum, the night lily, is a carnivorous flower that feeds on small rodents and insects that try to drink its nectar, said the barkeep, hands on hips and looking down at the dark-stained sheet the coroner had laid over what was left of Travag. After mating, Nempthi females gut the males with those tongues of theirs. They're as sharp as sword blades and a lot stronger than they look. Some kind of biological reaction to there being 20 nymph males for every female. The males seem to think it's worth it, to achieve the act of love. I saw them together in the cantina, but I didn't think Travag was crazy enough to try to bed the girl. "He was always bragging about being a great hunter," said Baloo wonderingly, stepping aside for the coroner's deputies to carry the body out of the dingy and blood-stained room. "You'd have thought he'd sense it coming." "How could he?" The bartender tucked his hands into his belt, followed the officer back out into the street. "For her it was the act of love, too." He shrugged and quoted an old Ithorian proverb current in some sections of the spaceways, and it's all gibberish, which loosely translated means the word for love in one language is the word for dinner in others. And that is the end of that story. So, the next one, which I won't go into tonight, is the Deveronian's Tale. Empire Blues, the Deveronian's Tale. So, yeah, we'll pick it up next Wednesday. And I'm going to take a very short break while I end this session, and then I'll come back and play a little bit of Hogwarts Legacy. So I will see you in a few minutes.